The Mockery, Ballroom Challenge. The Whitmore Grand Hotel had been standing in the heart of Manhattan for nearly a century, its towering columns and marble floors carrying the echo of countless galas, charity balls, and whispered scandals that came with wealth. On that particular evening, the chandeliers above the ballroom blazed brighter than ever, their golden light spilling across gowns woven with silver threads, tuxedos pressed to perfection, and champagne glasses raised high. It was the Whitmore Foundation Gala, an annual spectacle where the elite gathered not simply to celebrate generosity, but to parade their opulence and remind one another of their power. At the center of it all stood Logan Whitmore, heir to the empire that bore his name, his sharp suit tailored from Italian silk, his cufflinks shimmering like small captured suns. Logan was known across the city not merely for his wealth but for his biting wit, his ability to mock without raising his voice, to command a room without ever breaking his smile. He enjoyed attention the way others enjoyed air, and when deprived of it, he found ways to create a spark that pulled all eyes back onto him. That evening, however, attention had grown stale. The orchestra played elegantly, the guests murmured politely, but there was no real fire. Logan, swirling the champagne in his glass, sensed the lull. He detested lulls. They were the enemy of grandeur. His gaze swept the room, searching for something, anything that might ignite a moment worth remembering, and then his eyes fell on her. She was standing near the far wall, her black maid's uniform a shadow among the kaleidoscope of silks and jewels. Ava Johnson carried a silver tray with practiced grace, weaving between guests as if she had rehearsed each step. Her presence, quiet and precise, was the kind most of the wealthy barely noticed. To Logan, however, she was opportunity. He smirked as he lifted his glass, tapping a spoon against its rim. The sharp metallic ring sliced through the hum of conversation, drawing eyes toward him as he stood beneath the grand chandelier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a velvet thread stretched across the hall, "tonight I propose an experiment." Conversations hushed, curiosity piqued. He relished the pause, the power of anticipation resting in his palm. Then, with a smile that gleamed sharper than crystal, he raised his glass toward Ava. "If this young lady will dance a tango with me right here, right now, I will marry her before the night is over." The room erupted in a mixture of laughter and gasps. Some covered their mouths, others chuckled outright, and a few shook their heads in disbelief. It was an outrageous statement, the kind of theatrical challenge that Logan loved to unleash simply to watch people squirm. The guests were delighted by the spectacle, secure in their belief that the maid would either refuse or stumble, leaving Logan triumphant once again. Ava, however, felt the weight of every gaze suddenly crash upon her. The tray in her hand seemed to grow heavier as the laughter swirled around her like smoke. Her cheeks warmed, but her spine remained straight. She had served in this ballroom many times, and she knew the art of invisibility, the skill of vanishing into the background. Yet tonight there was no hiding. Logan walked toward her with deliberate steps, each one echoing across the marble floor. He moved as though the ballroom were his stage and the orchestra his personal soundtrack, his hand extended in mock gallantry, his smile daring her to take it. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice smooth but edged with mockery. "It's just a dance. Or do you even know what a tango is?" His words, though wrapped in charm, carried the sting of insult, and the audience roared with laughter at his arrogance. Ava looked at him, her dark eyes steady, her tray still clutched to her chest. She could feel the laughter pressing in from all sides, the weight of expectation urging her to retreat, to shake her head and disappear back into the shadows. But somewhere deep within her a voice stirred. It was the voice of her late mother, Isabel Moore, once a dancer of quiet renown whose elegance had lit stages far from ballrooms like this. Ava remembered being a little girl, watching her mother glide across worn wooden floors during rehearsals, her body speaking truths no words could capture. "Dance with your heart," her mother used to whisper, "not just your feet." That memory, fragile yet indestructible, rose now like a tide against the mockery in the air. With deliberate calm, Ava lowered the tray to the nearest cocktail table. The glasses clinked softly, their sound slicing through the laughter with a delicate finality. Conversation stalled, breaths caught, and for a fleeting moment the room's rhythm faltered. The orchestra seemed to inhale collectively, waiting. Then Ava lifted her gaze, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. She did not reach for Logan's hand immediately. Instead, she let her silence speak, her calmness unsettling the smug certainty on his face. When at last she extended her hand, it was steady, her fingers unshaking. The touch of her palm against his sent a ripple through the hall, not because of romance, but because of audacity. She was supposed to be intimidated, overwhelmed. Instead, she met him with composure that seemed to belong not to a maid, but to someone who had been waiting her entire life for this moment. Logan's grin widened, though beneath it flickered a spark of surprise. He had expected her to crumble, not to rise. "Let's make this night memorable," he murmured. The conductor lifted his baton. Instruments shifted in readiness, the bandoneon exhaling its first note like a sigh held too long. The violin drew out a thin line of sound, fragile yet unbroken, while the piano pressed a low chord that anchored the air. Together they wove the opening of the tango, and the ballroom leaned in. Phones were raised discreetly from the balconies, eager to capture what promised to be either humiliation or spectacle. Guests held their breath, torn between cruelty and curiosity. Logan stepped first, grand and theatrical, dragging his heel across the marble with exaggerated flourish. It was a move designed for applause, a shallow display meant to reinforce his dominance. Ava followed, not with equal flamboyance, but with quiet precision. Her body flowing like water, her gaze fixed steadily ahead. The crowd noticed, though they could not name it. Her movements carried an integrity that stripped away excess. Each turn, each pause seemed grounded not in show but in truth. As the dance unfolded, Logan pushed harder, pulling her sharply, spinning her with force, yanking her into poses meant to expose flaws. Yet Ava absorbed each gesture, not resisting but transforming it, her responses subtle yet profound. Where he tried to command, she revealed grace. Where he sought laughter, she birthed silence. With every step, she reclaimed the ground beneath her feet. No longer a servant gliding unnoticed, but a woman speaking in a language older than the chandeliers above. The ballroom shifted. The laughter waned, replaced by murmurs, then by silence as guests realized they were witnessing not mockery but mastery. Logan, once assured, found sweat beading on his forehead. He had underestimated her, and in doing so he had lit a fire that now consumed the room. Ava, the maid, was no longer invisible. She was the heartbeat of the tango, the center of a storm that had turned mockery into revelation. And as the final notes of the first sequence echoed into the vaulted ceiling, the ballroom stood suspended between disbelief and awe. For the first time in his life, Logan Whitmore felt the fragile tremor of losing control in front of an audience that had always adored him. Ava, meanwhile, stood poised, her breath steady, her eyes carrying the quiet strength of someone who had stepped beyond fear. The dance had only begun, but already the balance of power had shifted. The hidden flame, Ava's past. The ballroom still hummed with the memory of the first sequence, as though the notes of the tango lingered invisibly in the chandeliers and marble. Guests shifted uneasily, caught between the instinct to laugh at the absurd spectacle and the dawning realization that something remarkable was unfolding before them. Logan Whitmore, the man who had orchestrated the night's cruel entertainment, still wore his smile. But it had begun to look more like a mask than a natural expression. Ava Johnson, standing in the very center of that world of crystal and gold, felt her chest rise and fall with quiet rhythm, her body alive not just with movement but with memory. Because while the crowd saw only a maid daring to stand her ground, Ava herself stood on the edge of something much deeper. The weight of the moment pulled her inward, toward the chambers of her past where the first embers of her hidden flame had been lit. She had not asked for this stage. She had not expected it, but now that it had come, she understood that everything in her life had been preparing her for this very night. Her mother, Isabel Moore, had once been a name whispered reverently in small but passionate circles of the New York dance community. She had been no superstar. She had not claimed the grand stages of the Met or traveled the world in celebrated tours, but those who had seen her perform remembered her with awe, not because she dazzled with extravagance, but because she moved with honesty. Isabel's dances had not been mere steps but stories, each spin a sentence, each pause a wordless truth. For Ava, growing up in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Harlem, her mother's rehearsals had been more powerful than any fairy tale. She remembered sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching her mother practice when the sun slipped through the window blinds, striping the room with golden light. Isabel would close her eyes, raise her arms, and sway to music only she could hear, her body weaving pictures in the air. Sometimes Ava would mimic her small feet stumbling across the cracked linoleum, her laughter bubbling as her mother smiled and corrected her posture. "Not just your feet, Ava," Isabel would say gently, her hands warm on her daughter's shoulders. "Dance with your heart. Feet are only tools. The heart is what makes people listen." Those words had lodged deep in Ava's spirit, but so had the memory of loss. Isabel's health had faltered when Ava was still a teenager. Years of working 2 jobs, dancing when she could, cleaning houses when she couldn't, had worn her body down. The illness came quietly, then quickly, leaving Ava with little more than memories and lessons. Isabel passed away before her daughter had the chance to show the world what she herself had inherited. The apartment grew cold. The world seemed to shrink. And for Ava, survival became the only dance she could perform. She had been 15 when she first donned a uniform to work at the Whitmore Grand, not as a dancer, but as a cleaner. It had been humiliating at first, carrying trays, sweeping floors, polishing glasses that reflected lives of privilege she could never touch. Yet even in those quiet hours when the ballroom stood empty, Ava found ways to keep her flame alive. She would sometimes slip into the hall after her shift, when the orchestra was gone and the chandeliers dimmed. Alone on the vast marble floor, she would close her eyes and let the silence become her music. Her steps were tentative at first, the echo of her shoes startling in the emptiness. But then the memory of her mother's hand would guide her, and she would spin, sway, and glide until her breath grew heavy and her heart soared. She never performed for anyone, never sought an audience. The ballroom was her secret sanctuary, a place where the maid vanished and the dancer was born again. It was in those stolen moments that Ava learned resilience. Dance was no longer just an art. It became her rebellion against invisibility. Every movement was a declaration that she still existed, that she still carried within her the light of a mother who had refused to let poverty or illness extinguish her grace. Yet Ava never imagined that her secret world would collide with her work, that one day the very people who laughed at her presence would be forced to witness her fire. And so, as she now stood hand in hand with Logan Whitmore, surrounded by the murmurs and gasps of Manhattan's elite, Ava felt the presence of her past pressing close. It was not weakness. It was power. She remembered nights when hunger gnawed at her stomach, when her shoes were worn thin, when the city's noise outside her window felt like a reminder that she did not belong. She remembered tears cried quietly into pillows so as not to disturb the neighbors. And above all, she remembered her mother's voice, steady, kind, unyielding, telling her that dignity was not given by the world but claimed from within. The orchestra resumed, their instruments weaving a melody that seemed almost aware of the drama unfolding. Logan, seeking to regain control, tightened his grip and launched into another exaggerated sequence. Pulling Ava into a dramatic spin meant to expose her as an amateur. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the fall, for the stumble that would restore the hierarchy they depended on. But Ava did not stumble. Her body responded not with stiffness but with fluidity, absorbing the force and redirecting it, her movements as natural as breath. The murmur spread again, softer this time, tinged with awe. People began to whisper questions. Who was she? How did a maid learn to dance like this? Faces that had moments ago been gleeful with mockery now showed flickers of uncertainty, even admiration. Ava, without a word, was rewriting the room's script. Inside, she felt the fire of her hidden flame burn brighter. She was no longer merely surviving. She was rising. Each step, each turn was a reclaiming of years lost, of dreams deferred. She was not dancing just for herself or even against Logan's arrogance. She was dancing for her mother. For every silent rehearsal in that cramped apartment, for every unnoticed step she had taken on empty floors, she was proving that invisibility was not destiny. And though Logan still tried to lead with dominance, sweat glistening at his temples, Ava knew now that the balance had shifted irreversibly. He was dancing to prove his superiority. She was dancing to reveal her truth. And truth, once revealed, cannot be mocked. The battle of pride and grace, the tango duel. The orchestra's melody unfurled like a storm held tightly on a leash, its notes slicing through the golden air of the ballroom, urging the dancers into combat. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, breath suspended, as though their very lungs had been bound by the music's spell. Logan Whitmore, sweat glistening at his temples though his smile persisted, pulled Ava into a sharp lunge across the marble floor, his polished shoes skimming the surface with practiced elegance. He moved like a man used to winning, a man who had commanded applause with little more than a gesture his entire life. To him, the tango was another stage upon which he could assert his dominance, each dramatic flourish designed to draw gasps, each pull a reminder of his control. But tonight, he had underestimated the quiet figure in a maid's uniform who stood unflinching before his performance. Ava Johnson's body responded with fluid strength, her steps precise yet effortless, her balance unshaken even as Logan tried to jolt her off-center. Where he sought to shock with sharpness, she replied with steadiness. Where he tried to dazzle with force, she countered with grace. To the casual eye, it might have seemed as though she simply followed, but to the discerning it was clear she was weaving something more powerful. She was not resisting his lead. She was redefining it, transforming each attempt at mockery into a revelation of beauty. The audience began to notice. Whispers fluttered like restless birds across the balconies. At first they had expected disaster, the maid slipping, the tray shattering, the humiliation feeding their appetite for spectacle. Instead, they found themselves caught in a dialogue too intense to dismiss, a conversation without words where every movement was a question and every pause an answer. Logan's eyes flicked to the crowd, seeking the easy laughter he was accustomed to receiving. But what he found instead was silence, thick, watchful silence that no amount of wealth could command. He gripped her hand tighter, pulling her into a chest-to-chest hold that pressed their bodies together. The move exaggerated, almost desperate in its theatricality. The crowd inhaled sharply, waiting for her to falter, but Ava simply let the moment pass through her, her chin lifted, her posture unshaken. She did not resist the closeness, nor did she yield to it. She allowed it to exist without granting it power, and in doing so she stripped the gesture of its arrogance. The orchestra surged, violins slicing upward like streaks of light, and Ava turned, her simple black dress flaring just slightly as she spun, each thread of fabric catching the chandelier's glow. For a moment, the world contracted to a single heartbeat. The sound of her shoe striking marble, the pause of her breath, the shimmer of her gaze fixed not on Logan's pride but on something far beyond. She danced not to please him, not to amuse the guests, but to honor the truth within her. Every step carried echoes of her mother's whispered lessons. Every pivot a remembrance of nights spent alone on this very floor when no one cared to watch. She had lived in the margins of this ballroom for years, invisible as she swept its corners, polished its silver, and steadied trays beneath its chandeliers. Yet now, by nothing more than the strength of her poise, she had claimed the entire hall as her own. Logan's frustration deepened beneath his polished smile. He pressed harder, his movements growing more aggressive, his attempts at dominance sharper. He yanked her into quick spins, jerked her into sudden stops, hoping to catch her off guard, to shatter the composure that had begun to unravel his performance. But Ava absorbed it all. She moved with the patience of stone against wind, unyielding yet graceful, her body bending but never breaking. Each forced stop became, in her hands, a perfectly sculpted silence, as though the orchestra itself had conspired with her. The guests, accustomed to clapping for grand displays, now found themselves entranced by the subtler moments, the tilt of her chin, the steady rhythm of her breath, the quiet authority of her eyes. The duel intensified, no longer a mere dance but a battle of worlds colliding. Logan danced with the confidence of wealth, with the assurance that applause was his by right. Ava danced with the integrity of truth, with the knowledge that dignity could not be bought or mocked into silence. And though Logan's steps filled space with grandeur, Ava's filled it with meaning. One dazzled, the other endured. The orchestra sensed the shift, their music swelling in response to the tension. The bandoneon wept long notes that seemed to ache for release. The violins trembled with urgency. The piano's bass chords thudded like a heartbeat pressed against the chest of every onlooker. Phones hovered high in trembling hands, eager to capture the impossible sight. A maid, once invisible, now holding her ground against a millionaire in his own ballroom. Some mouths hung open. Others whispered to one another in disbelief. Even those who had come expecting nothing more than spectacle now found themselves on the edge of their seats, unwilling to look away. Logan spun her again, his breath quickening, his control slipping with every turn. He had imagined this would be easy, A flourish, a laugh, a moment of humiliation for the woman beneath him in station. But Ava had turned his weapon back on him. Every gesture meant to mock now revealed his desperation, and every move meant to dominate now illuminated her strength. He danced for pride. She danced for truth. And pride, weighed against truth, grew heavier with every passing note. Ava felt her own body thrum with the rhythm, her pulse matching the orchestra's climb. She was no longer aware of the faces watching, no longer conscious of the marble beneath her feet or the chandeliers burning above. She was in the presence of her mother again. In that small Harlem apartment where light streamed through blinds and dance was not performance but survival. She felt Isabel's hand steadying her shoulder, her voice whispering through memory. Dance with your heart. Ava, that is how you become more than what they see. And with every step, Ava did exactly that. The audience shifted once more. Where there had been laughter, now there was reverence. Where there had been mockery, now there was silence heavy with awe. Even the waitstaff, frozen in their tracks along the walls, stared as though they were witnessing not simply a dance but a transformation. The maid they had walked beside in corridors, shared quick conversations with in service kitchens, now stood before them as something greater. She was not serving tonight. She was commanding. The duel reached its height when Logan, nearly desperate, pulled Ava into a sudden violent dip, holding her body low against the marble as though to declare his victory in sheer physicality. The crowd gasped, certain this would be the breaking point. But Ava, calm even in the precarious angle, lifted her gaze directly into Logan's eyes. There was no fear in her expression, no shame, no submission. There was only quiet fire, a light that did not need chandeliers to burn. She rose from the dip not with his strength but with her own, her spine unbending, her breath unbroken. And in that moment Logan faltered. The orchestra struck a final, resounding chord, the violin shivering into silence, the piano dropping into a deep, trembling note that seemed to reverberate in every chest. The dancers froze, poised at the end of their duel. Logan's chest heaved, his face flushed despite the calm mask he tried to maintain. Ava stood tall, her shoulders squared, her breath steady, her eyes carrying the unmistakable brilliance of someone who had just claimed her rightful place. For a long moment, no one moved. The ballroom, accustomed to noise and chatter, to applause and laughter, held its silence as though afraid to shatter what had just been witnessed. Then slowly, hesitantly at first, applause began. A few hands clapped, then more, until the sound rolled across the hall like thunder. Guests who had arrived to sip champagne and revel in arrogance now stood on their feet, clapping not for Logan but for the maid who had silenced him. And as Ava stood beneath the chandeliers, her uniform still marking her station, but her presence transcending it, she realized that she had not only faced Logan's mockery, she had defeated it. The tango was no longer his weapon. It was her triumph. The revelation, her true identity. The thunder of applause still rolled across the ballroom like waves striking a cliff. But within the crashing rhythm there was an undercurrent. Questions murmured, eyes wide with disbelief, hearts unsettled by what they had just witnessed. The glittering guests, so used to consuming spectacle and discarding it with the next sip of champagne, could not dismiss what had happened. It was more than a performance. Something about Ava's presence, her poise, her dignity, had shaken the room into silence before the clapping began, and now that applause felt less like celebration and more like surrender. Logan Whitmore stood stiff beside her, his hand still clasping hers though the grip had loosened. His lips curved into a smile that no longer carried confidence but something brittle, as though it might splinter with the wrong touch. He had built his life on control, on commanding rooms, bending people with charm or with ridicule. Yet he felt for the first time in memory, as though the ground beneath his feet was not his own. The applause was not for him. The eyes fixed on the stage of marble and chandeliers no longer adored him. They belonged to her, the maid, the woman he had chosen as the butt of his joke. The orchestra lowered their instruments, the final notes still trembling in the air like threads refusing to snap. And then from the front row a voice rose, measured, calm, but carrying with it the weight of recognition. She is not a stranger. The words cut through the applause, silencing it almost instantly. Heads turned, and there, rising slowly from his chair, was Harold Bennett. Silver-haired, dignified, and frail with age, Bennett was a name written in the foundation of the city's art. His patronage had carried entire seasons of performances. His criticism had built and destroyed reputations, and his love for dance was whispered about in reverence. Even Logan's father, the late Arthur Whitmore, had deferred to Harold's opinions at these galas, careful never to fall on the wrong side of his judgment. Tonight Bennett stood with his cane in one hand, his eyes locked not on Logan but on Ava. "I know that turn," Harold continued, his voice growing firmer, resonating in the quiet hall. "I know that frame, the way she holds herself. I saw it many years ago when I watched her mother dance." The room gasped in unison, as though a secret had just been dragged from the shadows. "She is the daughter of Isabel Moore." The name struck like a chord plucked too sharply, sending vibrations through every guest present. Some older faces in the room shifted with recognition, eyes widening, whispers spilling into the air. Isabel Moore, though not a household name, was remembered by those who had known the smaller but purer circles of dance. She had been the performer who graced the modest stages, whose movements carried such truth that critics wrote about her as though she were light incarnate. She had never been wealthy, never been celebrated in tabloids or given grand titles, but those who had witnessed her dances remembered, because she had been unforgettable. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to questions. Isabel Moore? Could it be? She looks like her, doesn't she? Yes, the posture, it's the same. But she's a maid? Confusion spread like fire across the glittering crowd. For all their wealth, for all their knowledge of names and families and dynasties, they had not seen Ava until tonight. And now, revealed before them, she was no longer invisible. She was legacy. Ava herself felt the words strike her chest like a bell. Her mother's name, spoken aloud in this hall, was both wound and balm. For years she had carried it silently, hidden beneath uniforms and trays, whispered only to herself in dark rooms when grief was too heavy. To hear it now, spoken with reverence, was like watching her mother rise again in the glow of the chandeliers. Ava's throat tightened, her breath trembling, but she did not falter. Instead, she straightened her spine, letting the truth settle into her bones. Logan's face shifted almost imperceptibly, but those closest could see it. The tightening jaw, the twitch at the corner of his mouth. He had intended to mock her, to display his dominance. Instead, he had been the stage upon which her identity was unveiled. His arrogance, the accidental spark that revealed her brilliance. And worse, he realized, the crowd was turning. The laughter that had always been his ally was gone. In its place was awe, respect, even admiration, but not for him. Bennett stepped forward slowly, leaning on his cane, his eyes never leaving Ava. "I remember her mother's last performance," he said, his voice low but clear enough for the hall to hear. "I remember watching Isabel Moore on a stage far smaller than this, with no chandeliers above her, no gowns glittering in the audience. She danced with nothing but her heart, and it was enough to fill the room with truth. Tonight I see the same truth in her daughter." His words hung in the air like a verdict. Guests began to nod, some with reluctant acknowledgement, others with genuine awe. The hierarchy of the evening, the rigid order of who belonged and who did not, had been fractured. The maid had become more than they had ever allowed themselves to see. She was not merely a servant in their gilded world. She was bloodline, artistry, resilience. She was her mother's daughter, and tonight she had stepped into her own name. The orchestra remained silent, their instruments resting, as if they too understood that the music had shifted from melody to revelation. In the hush, Harold Bennett's voice lingered in the air like the echo of a church bell. "She is not a stranger." And with that truth unveiled, the balance of the night was shattered forever. The silence and the rise, her triumph. The air in the Whitmore Grand Ballroom felt altered, as though the chandeliers had dimmed their brilliance not from lack of power, but out of reverence for what had just unfolded. The echo of Harold Bennett's declaration still reverberated in the walls. She is not a stranger. In that moment, the woman who had entered as a maid was no longer a shadow moving through the excess of others. She was revealed, uncovered, transformed into someone who carried not only her mother's legacy, but her own unmistakable fire. The guests sat or stood in a kind of stunned stillness, their faces pale or flushed, their jeweled hands resting idly on glasses that had long lost their sparkle. No one dared laugh anymore. No one dared whisper mockery. The silence was no longer empty. It was pregnant with meaning, a silence that demanded respect. And in that silence stood Ava Johnson, shoulders squared, her chest rising steadily, her dark eyes shining with the unmistakable truth of a woman who had claimed her rightful place in a world that had refused her existence. Logan Whitmore, meanwhile, felt the walls close in. He had started the night as its master, the conductor of its attention, the crown prince of mockery. Yet now he felt like a marionette whose strings had been cut, standing awkwardly beside a woman who had stripped him of power without a single insult, without a single raised voice. She had taken his stage, his orchestra, his spotlight, and turned them into instruments of her own truth. And what unsettled him most was that she had done it without malice. Her grace was not designed to humiliate him, though it had. Her strength was not performed for vengeance, though it revealed his weakness. She had simply stood tall in the face of arrogance, and in doing so, made arrogance itself crumble. The orchestra waited for a cue that never came. The conductor lowered his baton slowly, realizing that the music had ended not with their instruments but with Ava's steady gaze. One by one, the musicians placed their bows down, the sound of wood meeting metal echoing faintly across the hall like drops of rain. The audience remained seated, still clapping in fragments, some rising hesitantly to their feet, then more, until the sound of applause swelled again, this time not as thunder, not as command, but as reverence. It was in that moment Ava realized she had done what her mother had always believed she could do. Not entertain, not impress, but transform. She had forced a room built on wealth and hierarchy to recognize truth, to see dignity where they had once seen only servitude. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the enormity of what she had carried through. She looked upward, to the glowing chandelier above, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined her mother's face there, smiling through the light, whispering the same words that had guided her since childhood. Dance with your heart. Harold Bennett began to clap again, his frail hands strong in their conviction, his eyes moist with memory. Others followed, their clapping no longer hesitant but wholehearted. Guests who had moments ago laughed at Ava now clapped until their palms burned, not because they suddenly understood her fully, but because they knew they had been in the presence of something they could not ignore. Some even bowed their heads slightly, a gesture foreign to such a hall, yet somehow appropriate. Logan tried once more to seize the moment, his smile widening as though he could still craft it into a spectacle of his own design. He raised his glass again, his voice smooth but cracking at the edges. Ladies and gentlemen, what a night we've had. Truly, we've witnessed something memorable. But his words fell flat. They rang hollow in the charged silence that Ava had created. The audience did not respond with laughter or agreement. They did not lift their glasses. Their eyes remained fixed on her, as if the millionaire at the center of the gala had ceased to exist. Logan's words, once sharp enough to cut, now fluttered uselessly in the air like broken feathers. Ava lowered her gaze at last, her eyes sweeping across the hall, taking in the faces that had once looked through her. She saw surprise, respect, even shame written in their expressions. She did not smile, for this was not a victory of triumphalism. It was a victory of truth, and truth did not gloat. Truth simply stood, undeniable and unshaken. She curtsied, not deeply, not with servility, but with a quiet grace that acknowledged the moment without yielding to it. Then, without waiting for permission, she stepped back, released Logan's hand, and walked toward the edge of the ballroom. Each step she took across the marble floor echoed louder than any words Logan could muster, louder than any music the orchestra might have played. It was the sound of reclamation, of a woman walking out not as a servant but as someone who had silenced a hall with nothing but her presence. The crowd parted as she passed, like waves opening for a vessel that belonged to the sea. Some reached out as if to touch her, to anchor themselves to the truth she carried. Others simply lowered their eyes, unable to meet the dignity they had once mocked. Phones followed her, recording her retreat, capturing the image of a woman transformed, her plain black uniform glowing with the weight of legacy. At the doors of the ballroom she paused. She turned not to Logan, not to the chandeliers, but to Harold Bennett. Their eyes met, and for a brief second it was as though time folded in on itself. The old man seeing once more the dancer he had admired decades ago, now reborn in her daughter. Ava nodded once, a gesture of respect, gratitude, and promise. Harold returned the nod, tears glistening in his eyes, his lips moving silently as if whispering a prayer of thanks. Then Ava pushed open the heavy doors, and the ballroom's golden light spilled into the marble foyer beyond. The applause followed her, surging, uncontainable until the very wall seemed to tremble with it. She walked forward steadily, her shoes clicking against the floor, each sound an affirmation of who she was. By the time the doors closed behind her, the gala itself felt diminished, as though the true heart of the night had already left. Inside, Logan stood abandoned in his own hall, the applause no longer his to claim. He lowered his glass slowly, his face pale, his pride shattered. For perhaps the first time in his life he realized that wealth and arrogance could not command reverence. Only truth could. And he had just been forced to learn that lesson from the very woman he had mocked. The ballroom guests continued to clap, some now chanting softly, "Ava, Ava," as if her name itself had become a melody. The orchestra lifted their instruments once more, but not to play the tango. Instead, they struck a softer tune, something reverent, something almost sacred, as though to honor the presence that had left the room but had not left their spirits. And in the city beyond the hotel, word was already spreading. Videos of the dance, of the silence, of Harold Bennett's revelation had begun to flow through the veins of social media. By dawn, the world would know her name. The maid who had danced with the millionaire. The daughter of Isabel Moore. The woman who had silenced an entire ballroom with grace. For Ava Johnson, however, none of that mattered in this moment. As she walked into the quiet night air, the city stretching wide before her, she felt only the warmth of her mother's presence in her heart. She knew she had carried Isabel's legacy into the light once more, but more importantly, she had discovered her own. She had learned that dignity was not given by others but claimed within, and once claimed, it could never be taken away. The night sky above glittered with stars, faint against the blaze of the city's lights, but Ava saw them clearly. She breathed deeply, steady and calm, and with each breath she knew that she had not only danced a tango, she had danced her truth. And in doing so, she had reminded an entire hall, an entire city, and perhaps even herself, that silence could be louder than laughter, and grace could be stronger than pride. And so, Ava walked on, no longer a shadow, no longer invisible, but a woman who had risen from mockery into legend.